Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Compliance Week and Skillsoft. I'm Alyson McDevitt with Compliance Week, and I will be one of today's panelists. Today's webcast is Compliance Considerations to Prepare for Returning to the Office. Before we hear from our presenters, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll post them to our guests at the end of their presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please be sure you are using either Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser, and you've disabled your pop-up blockers in order to ensure access to the exam. Once I've signed off and the webcast is completely over, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcast@complianceweek.com. Once again, to ensure receipt of your CPE credit, please be sure you are using Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet browser. If you've missed anything, I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts, as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can also hit the View Slide Full Screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speakers and guests. It's my pleasure to introduce Amy Foote, partner with global advisory firm StoneTurn. Amy has advised public and private sector clients on compliance issues involving workplace discrimination and sexual harassment, commercial disputes, governance issues, and complex litigation and investigations. As I mentioned, my name is Alyson McDevitt. I'm a data and research journalist at Compliance Week. And finally, we also have Charlie Voelker, Director of Legal Compliance Solution at Skillsoft. In this role, Charlie is responsible for the development, maintenance, and sales support of the company's cloud-based compliance training content for global enterprises. And Charlie will serve as today's host for the content. Great to have you both with us. With that, I will turn it over to Charlie to get us started.
Well, thank you, Alyson, and hello to everyone. I'm delighted to be part of today's session, in which we will talk about the Getting Back to Work survey that Compliance Week and Skillsoft conducted recently. First, we'll talk about the respondents' reports about how working from home is going. Then we'll discuss some strategies that companies can consider for improving remote work for their employees. And finally, we'll get into some thoughts about returning to the workplace, which we hope will happen soon in a post-pandemic world. After that will be the Q&A that Alyson mentioned a moment ago. So Alyson, I'll start with a question for you. Can you give us some background, please? Who did you survey and who contributed to the report?
Absolutely. So the vast majority of respondents that we surveyed resided in the U.S., about 83%, with just a fraction coming from Europe, non-U.S. North America, the Middle East, Africa regions, and Asia Pacific. Almost a quarter of respondents worked in financial services. Other notable industries included manufacturing, energy and utilities, and business services. Respondents ranged in age and seniority at their organizations. The majority of respondents were in their 40s and 50s, about 58% of them. The most commonly occurring job titles were compliance manager, auditor, and chief compliance officer. I also spoke with Janice Attell, legal compliance product manager at Skillsoft, and Allison von Gruningen, an environmental health and safety product manager at Skillsoft, about the survey's findings.
Well, speaking of those findings, what can you tell us about the state of remote work at this point?
Well, what we found is that the good news for companies is that by and large, work productivity has really been impervious to the strain of the coronavirus pandemic. 86% of 180 respondents across compliance, risk, and audit are currently working remotely at least most of the time. In our report, we refer to this group of people as telecommuters. And more than 3/4 of these telecommuters said that they are equally or more productive working from home, which means that 20% said that their work output had waned. We have to bear in mind that when employees do return to work, it will not be the same, and in a minute we will discuss this, but nearly 2/3 of respondents say that they plan to return to the office only part-time post-pandemic.
Interesting. So in keeping for a moment with the theme about returning to the workplace, for the most part, are employees eager to do that, or is there something to be said for the benefits of a remote working arrangement?
It's kind of a mixed bag. So the majority of respondents would prefer to get back to the office as soon as it's safe and feasible, just maybe not full-time. 88% of telecommuters imagined that they would definitely be returning to the office post-pandemic, but nearly 1/4 of that group, at 23%, plan to return to the office full-time, while almost 2/3, 62%, said they would want to return only part-time. And we asked the question, what is it that is drawing people back to office life? And the answer was human contact. I guess that would be unsurprising. The greatest challenge of working remotely, cited by the telecommuters group, was missing in-person interaction and collaboration.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so let's talk for a moment then about one of the risks that has emerged in remote work, and this kind of goes to the issue of interpersonal relationships and interaction, but discrimination and harassment. Can you tell us what the respondents of the survey had to say about their experiences with discrimination or harassment as they've been working in the remote environment?
Sure. So the vast majority of respondents said that they have not seen a rise in inappropriate conduct or communications on messaging platforms or video media or video meeting applications since we all went remote last spring. But at the same time, that means 21% have. So when I spoke to Janice Attal of Skillsoft, she said that actually 21% of respondents who saw this increase is actually pretty alarming. That's still a significant difference in some ways. The reality is that, and this is Janice speaking, the reality is that problems are on the rise, probably more than what has been reported. An employee is no longer in a situation where they can leave their desk and walk into the HR department. Employees are at home and may not know what ways they are able to report this misconduct. And in our research, we also uncovered a report from last fall from CNN that identified different exacerbating factors in a remote workforce that might lead to some of this misconduct. And some of the things that report came up with were overwork, under recognition, morale depletion, and just the fact that information often gets lost in translation when people are limited to interacting over email and they lose that aid of face-to-face communication.
Amy, I'll direct this next question to you. In your experience, what are some examples of discriminatory behavior or harassing behavior that employees seem to be facing in this work-from-home setting?
Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar, and welcome to everybody who's participating. It's a very good question because I have heard in the past 9-10 months a number of clients comment to me about saying that the risk of discrimination and harassment, particularly sexual harassment, in a fully remote or even partially remote work environment must have decreased over this time because there is little in-person interaction, but that as you saw from Alyson's findings, is not necessarily the case. You do not need to have in-person interaction for discrimination or harassment to occur. And one of the biggest areas of concerns that companies, I think, should focus on, which may come as no surprise, is inappropriate online communication. So the behaviors that constitute discrimination and harassment have not changed in a remote working environment, but in a remote work situation, the settings and the methods of communication have changed. So whereas before the pandemic, you likely had an employer-controlled office environment, now the office environment is in your home, and all of your communication is online. And those changes, coupled with the stress caused by the pandemic, have created the possibility and the real risk for inappropriate communication. So employees have become less formal in communication, which can lead to being too casual. I mean, we're all at home in our sweatpants, and it is a less formal environment because interaction is online and in some cases mirrors social media like chats and texting. There has also been a tendency we've seen to treat coworkers like online friends, which can lead, as we all know, to behaviors that could create a hostile work environment. We've also seen an uptick in aggressive behavior, which for someone who is not in person and having to sit next to the person you're communicating with online, it is easier to be harsher or bolder or more impulsive if you don't have that in-person accountability. People, as I mentioned earlier, are also feeling pressure and stress during this time for a prolonged period of time, and that we've seen has caused inappropriate responses or behaviors that you otherwise may not exhibit. So I think in a remote work environment, that is the biggest risk, and coupled with the pressures of the pandemic, is inappropriate online communication, whether it's just joking around, whether it's commenting on, someone's age. We've also seen some age discrimination complaints because of the technology factor of working remotely. There are comments sometimes people make, and in a situation where comments are repeated, or depending on where you are geographically, even if it's one or two comments, it can create under a legal liability for your company. Another area of concern, an example of discriminatory behavior that we've seen is discrimination based on childcare responsibilities. As we all know, those who are primarily responsible for taking care of children have felt a huge burden during this time, and that can cause even overtly or inadvertently penalties from a company to a parent or someone also who is caring for a sick family member. It can influence the decision making of an employer as to who gets what assignment, who is advanced within a company. Those are the key areas that we've seen over the past 10 months that are important for companies to take a really hard look at.
Well, it certainly raises a question then, Amy, as to what compliance professionals and their HR counterparts can do to help address these challenges. Are there any best practices that you've seen to be effective that they may want to consider?
Well, I think that first and foremost is to review your policies relating to discrimination and harassment, and ensure that they are up to date and compliant with the law, and ensure that they are at the top of mind of your workforce. Also, training. You can do a full training on discrimination and harassment, or modular training to focus on certain areas that are the greatest risk for your company. One other thing to know is the law. So if you're thinking about a hostile work environment that could be created through comments or inappropriate online behavior, in the past several years in many jurisdictions across the country, the standard for determining whether a hostile work environment claim is made by a plaintiff has been lowered. So I'm from New York. In New York State and in New York City, the standard was lowered from a standard that the conduct has to be severe or pervasive to a conduct that rises above the level of petty slights and trivial inconveniences. So if you think about that, a severe or pervasive standard, which is also the federal standard, is a relatively high standard to jump over as a plaintiff. So if somebody is making jokes about your age, that you know, using inappropriate, words to describe you, if that happens a couple of times under a severe or pervasive standard, it may not constitute a hostile work environment. Under a lower standard in New York City or New York State or other jurisdictions across the country, it could be. And so it needs to be taken extremely seriously, the way people interact online, and including in chats. And I believe your workforce would need to be reminded periodically of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Those are the major areas that I would focus on.
Well, thank you for that insight, Amy. To get back for the moment then to the survey, no doubt the big question on everybody's mind at this point is when will we be able to return to the office? So Alyson, what did the survey tell us about that? What did the respondents have to say about when they expect that might happen?
Well, it sounds like remote work, unsurprisingly, will be the status quo for the foreseeable future. That's definitely the overwhelming perception of the respondents that we surveyed. Just over a third, 35%, predicted they wouldn't return to the office until early to mid-2021, and now here we are at the end of January, and probably looking more towards mid-2021 at the earliest. Another 37% didn't even bother to venture a guess.
So it sounds like we still have some time to get through with the remote environment. So in light of that, how are employees rating their overall satisfaction with working from home?
Yeah, we sure are. The majority of respondents said that their employer has supported them enough to be successful in working remotely. 88% agreed on that. But for that 12% who said their employer has not done enough to support them in their remote work situation, the anecdotal comments that came up revealed some of the sources of their disgruntlement. So for many, it was technology related. Some complained about the access issues, lack of equipment, things that they felt precluded them from carrying out their job functions adequately.
were there any specific changes that the respondents identified that, that might alleviate some of those concerns?
Well, we did receive a number of anonymous anecdotes, and I'm going to share one from a CEO of an organization in the energy and utilities industry who said that on first glance, access to data and networks are fine, but knowing what to look for and where is the struggle. And others struggle to do their job at home due to kids hanging around, a lack of home office safety, and a lack of quality IT. So a lot of the things that I'm sure people are not surprised to hear.
Amy, back to you for a moment. Another risk that has impacted remote working is the concerns around cybersecurity. Last spring, IT departments were faced with the task of moving from an office-based model to a remote model practically overnight. So, this far into the pandemic, what is the state of cybersecurity at this stage?
Well, that's a big question. I think it's ever evolving. I think we're, as you mentioned, past the point of thinking that it is a short-term solution and a Band-Aid that needs to be placed over it until everybody gets back to the office. I think IT and cybersecurity professionals within companies, if they have not already yet done so, are in the process of designing and implementing long-term plans to address the unique risks involved with the partially or fully remote workplace. One of the main concerns of clients that we've heard in a fully remote and partially remote work environment is confidentiality and security of a company's data and information. And I think that it's pretty self-evident why working from home or working outside of a controlled office environment, exposes companies to risks with respect to their data. One issue that raises or has raised, I think that has caused a shift in perspective is, pre-pandemic, we often thought of IT and cybersecurity as your operations problem. They're going to, your IT department's going to have to, deal with these issues and figure out ways to give us our resources, the workers, employees' resources and tools to do their jobs, but also protect the data. And I think there's a real shift to for companies to clarify an employee's role while at home in protecting company data. It is not just an IT department role. It is everybody's role to protect their own data. And in doing that, they need to be provided, the employees need to be provided with training on IT security and data privacy. The training can be modular training, so it's easily digestible pieces of information over a period of time. I've seen it also work well when the training is in multiple formats so that it is reinforced. And I've seen testing the behavior work well also. So I have a client that sends phishing emails to its workforce and then they publish the data of who clicked on it, who clicked on the email, who clicked through to whatever website the fake phishing email was trying to get you to. And so it really, over time, has really trained the employees to look to see, one, is it from the IT department? Are they trying to trick me? Or is it, is this a real phishing email? And I need to be mindful of that. So I think that's sort of where we are with the IT and cybersecurity, but it is definitely an emerging and ever-evolving issue within companies.
So Amy, are there any best practices here that you've sort of been able to distill down in your experience that, that may help with organizations as they continue to refine their approach to IT and cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we've spoken about, this is a long-term issue and needs investment from companies in order to do it right from the beginning. And a review, sort of a wholesale review of a company's policies and procedures with an eye towards how is this going to protect our company if, one of our employees is working from the Starbucks down the street or, from a home office. So that would include also reviewing records management policies, data protection policies, information security policies, and then ensuring that senior management is on board with whatever policies, are chosen or decided are the best for any particular company. And also, importantly, I think that providing guidance for mobile devices, because that's where a huge risk is for companies, whether it be you have to have a company mobile device to do work, and a personal mobile device to do all personal things, but provide guidance for your employees and also appropriate training.
Amy,
Alyson, back to you for. Oh, I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
I just noticed there was just a clarifying question in the Q&A at the bottom. And I don't know the answer. Is vishing the same as phishing? Just because we're on this slide and it mentions it.
Oh, I didn't see that question. So the question is vishing the same as phishing?
Yes.
I don't have the answer to that. I don't think they're the same.
Maybe it means video phishing.
It's a different way. It's a different way, I believe, that somebody is trying to get access to your data. So I think phishing is with emails, and I think vishing is with messages, recorded calls or messages.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
That's what I understand. But we do have at StoneTurn, I do have a colleague who is very good at this, and I wish he were on my phone a friend right now. But I believe that's the case.
No, I think you're right.
All right, so Alyson, we know that bringing employees back into the workplace is going to present its own set of challenges, yet another transition that employers have to face. So what are some of the areas of concern that the survey respondents voiced about that process of returning to the office?
So some of the themes that came up were concerns that Amy has talked about already today, but basically employers potentially not having a formal plan or a plan with enough contingencies to it. So, every individual employee has their own extenuating circumstances, whether that means, they have children at home or they have aging parents at home, they're in charge of their child or children that's at home schooling. So some of the respondents talked about those things. There were a few respondents who said that they felt that employees that do go back to the office should somehow be rewarded, assuming that they've gone back before COVID has been fully eradicated. And some people actually mentioned that they have an employer who has pressured them to return to office, despite the fact that they've been able to perform their duties remotely with no issues. Other respondents identified as having underlying health conditions, which would put them at a higher risk for severe symptoms of COVID-19, as we know. And, they have these valid and real health concerns, but there really is no one-size-fits-all approach that an employer can take when it comes to having people come back to the office. And having everyone do the same thing to these respondents just seems too simplistic and too hazardous. We did have one comment from somebody who said that at their organization, some departments were exempting themselves from returning to work. So then that's a potential situation too. I think the major concern, just to sum up, is how is an employer going to account for everyone's special circumstances? And how is the company going to continue enforcing their COVID-19 policies?
Well, that
Allie,
brings us.
Can I ask a quick question?
I'm sorry,
Charlie?
go right ahead.
Allie,
Certainly,
yeah,
of course.
Allie, when you said that departments were, I actually can't remember the word, exempting themselves, what does that mean? Did you have an understanding?
It was just one anecdotal response, so I don't necessarily know if we can extrapolate as a trend, but this person happened to say that, I feel bad calling out this department, but that the HR department might say, we're not going into the office, but everyone else has to go in. I think that's what the comment was saying, and I don't know if that's a situation that's sort of anomalous or if that's something that could commonly occur anywhere.
I understand. Thank you.
So, Amy, I'm wondering if you might be able to share some insights about some strategies or ideas that employers might use to try to ease this transition. Both from a perspective, I think, of fairness, which seems to underlie a lot of the concerns that have been expressed by the survey respondents, and balancing that with the precautions that employers have to be aware of related to, COVID safety. So any thoughts there on sort of how an employer might figure out their way through that balance?
That's a heavy question. That's $1 million question. What I will say first is OSHA and the EEOC both have issued very detailed guidance regarding the areas of how to go back to work and what's permissible, what's not permissible. And so I would encourage the listeners to read those, and you will also have state and local laws and procedures that you will need to follow when and if your office does open, and even not just state and local laws, but office building by office building specific procedures that you have to follow. So it's really a huge task for, I think, companies and compliance departments, because you first have to be in compliance with every law that's applicable to you, but you also have to manage from an HR standpoint everyone's unique individual circumstances that everyone who makes up your workforce. And it's a daunting task. And I think if you can take it small chunks at a time, it's a little easier. But on top of all of that, the guidance and the situation in the United States and really all over the world is changing on a day-to-day basis. While the vaccination program has been rolled out, it is nobody really knows when there will be enough vaccinations administered to alleviate the concerns of everybody in your workforce to go back to work. But I would encourage companies to start talking about it now. you're going to have to look at your work from home policy and revise it. And there are going to be very, I think, diverging views as to what you're going to do in the coming months and the coming years. And if you don't start talking about it now and have those difficult discussions, you're going to come up against a deadline. And frankly, the employees and the workforce want to have some sort of idea of the of what's going to happen. So I would first start with your work at home policy. If you haven't already considered opening your office, a number of our clients have, in our firm actually, our offices are open. Not very many people are going in, but they've already gotten over that hump of how do we open the office securely and safely. Consider any kind of changes to your office design, at least for the near term, to minimize any health risks. I know most offices are getting rid of their kitchens. Consider your vaccination policy. Are you going to require that all employees be vaccinated? And if not, how are you going to deal with a person who decides not to be vaccinated? Another consideration would be accommodations for high-risk employees with high-risk health considerations. These are all very difficult issues, but the earlier you think about them and the earlier you get buy-in from senior management, the better. And one point about that is senior management has to buy into every policy. There cannot be a divergence of views on that because it puts employees in an impossible situation. If the policy is if you're not feeling well or if you feel safer to be at home and work, but your senior manager, it will be upset if you do not come into the office. It puts employees in an impossible situation, and perhaps the company have some legal liability.
Amy, can I ask a question about something you
Sure.
just said?
Yeah.
You mentioned that employers should be considering their vaccination policy and whether they want to require employees to get vaccinated. I didn't know that employers could do that. They can actually enforce that?
It's my understanding that they can. And the EEOC has issued guidance on this. So I would, as these issues are emerging, would encourage everyone to look at the EEOC guidance on it. But the EEOC has not issued guidance on whether you should or should not do it. The EEOC has issued guidance on whether it is violates the law if you require vaccination. And I think, now I'm forgetting, I think it was Dollar General wants their entire workforce to be vaccinated, so they're offering, cash or bonuses to people who are vaccinated. So there are policy issues that you have to, make decisions on, and then how are you going to enforce that?
That's interesting. Thank you.
So, Amy, to dovetail with what you just covered there, when you look at a company's sort of traditional compliance program, aspects such as their code of conduct, their approach to employee training, or even things like sick leave policies, how do you envision that those things may be changing as part of this process of trying to get employees back into the workplace and restore some sense of normalcy, if you will, to the way we go about work?
Well, I see the policies changing, at least in the near term, to be more generous. Maybe not the right word, but more flexible for employees. I mean, I think this past year has been really difficult in a lot of ways for a lot of people. and in many ways that employers don't know about. And I think that if you want to keep your workforce and you want to focus on, improving morale and keep focusing on your culture and what kind of culture and what kind of company you are, I think those types of policies will become much more permissive, at least in the near term.
Well, thank you, Amy, and also Alyson, for all of your insights with these questions here. That's all I have as questions go. So, Alyson, I'll turn it back over to you to see what questions we've received from the audience today.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for hosting, Charlie, and Amy, thank you again for sharing all of your insights today. Before we get into the Q&A, I'm just going to address some housekeeping items for the webcast. So if you would like a copy of the slides just presented, you can download it from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Now we'll move to the Q&A part of our session. We have lots and lots of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to give Amy just a moment to scan them, and then I will pick one. Okay, Amy, you ready?
I think so.
Okay. For parents or those with dependents, working remotely has been a very different experience, so this is something that came up. Can you talk about some of the best practices for supporting those employees who have to balance their work and family responsibilities? This came up a number of times in the Q&A.
Sure. It's a great question, and it's something that I could talk about for a very long time. Childcare issues and issues relating to the workforce have been issues we've been discussing for many, many years. The pandemic has brought a really fine focus on the impossible situation, basically, that working parents who are primary caregivers have. And included in that is that, your typical caregiver that would step in while you're at work, was unavailable or could have been unavailable for a period of time. I think with respect to parents who have felt the stress and have had to make choices with respect to their work, whether or not to take some time off or to limit some of your matters or limit your work in some respect in order to keep the family moving forward. It was a pretty remarkable and has been a pretty remarkable time period. And I think when I spoke about more permissive policies, this is a situation where I think companies really need to take a hard look at how they're treating primary caregivers, what opportunities those primary caregivers have had prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic. And also pay equity, and how that pay equity compares to people of similar, employees of similar, level and similar job responsibilities. And really take a role in making sure that there's no retaliation for people who have had childcare responsibilities. And it's not just childcare. I would probably include in that also, sick family members or other family members who are more at risk in this environment. To evaluate the policies and to really look at how the company, you can do it on a metrics basis, and you can do it within the HR department, has treated those people who have had those special circumstances or those pressures that other people have not. You could even have somebody be designated as the person, and you can give them some sort of title or role as the person to ensure. Sometimes people call them retaliation officers, which doesn't necessarily sound great, but there are people who are tasked with ensuring that there is no retaliation. So retaliation or adverse impact of, dealing with this life circumstance that's been really difficult and unprecedented in our lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Another question that came up has to do with performance reviews. So sort of related here. This person said, how can I be sure I'm fairly evaluating employees' performance when I'm not in the office with them every day? Are there any potential blind spots I should be aware of?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in a remote working environment and the transition to possibly going back to work, as a manager, as somebody who is responsible for reviewing and evaluating employees, I think it's important throughout this entire period of time to have regular check-ins. If you're not speaking to these people that you're evaluating on a regular basis, multiple times a week, due to work, to your workflow, I would schedule coffee catch-ups, check-ins. They can be 5 to 10 minutes, so that you know, one, what issues the person is having, if any, and two, you have a better understanding of how that person is responding within the work environment, this new work environment, I should say. I think that goes a very long way. I also would evaluate the person's work performance, if possible, prior to the pandemic, and use that as a data point to determine how the work performance has changed, if at all, during the pandemic. And maybe sort of on a scale, give a little bit of room for people who have had a difficult time during this period. There are hard decisions that companies are making. We're in a very difficult and economic period, and there may be hard decisions that companies have to make based on profitability. But if you have that room to give a little bit of leeway to account for the unprecedented, stressful time that we have, I think that it will go a long way to improve morale. I think your employees will see that and appreciate that.
Thank you, Amy. I have a third question here, and this is about training. This person says, my company's not going back to the office until the summer at the earliest, and I need to think about training to address some of these remote office risks. What should I prioritize? Which training?
Which type of training? I would prioritize, one, anything that you need to have done, need to do based on your state, city, local law. And so, for example, in a number of states, we had talked about sexual harassment before. You have to have sexual harassment training every year, and you have to, if you have new employees, they have to be trained within a certain period of time. So anything that you have to do, I would prioritize that. I had actually a client say not too long ago that he wasn't prioritizing sexual harassment training because he didn't think that it was, this was the compliance officer of a company, because he didn't think that it was a big enough risk, and maybe the government would understand why he wouldn't be able to do it. But you still have to do it. And then I would prioritize any training that has to do with an employee's requirements, or what an employee has to do in order to go back to work safely, the broad category. But I think in this environment, and increasing and supporting morale and the culture of a workplace, mental health also has to be prioritized in any way that your company wants to do that. And this is getting off to a little bit of a different subject, but also to determine, what are the needs of your company and where are the issues. You could do things like touch point or climate surveys, just little 5-minute surveys to see where the risks are, and then you can use that data to inform where you think the training is most important, or what training is most important.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Just related to that, I saw some questions relating to if I have, if you have employees in different states and your company is in another state, how do I decide what compliance rules govern? And what we advise our clients is, depending on what type of organization you are and where you are located, really you should use as your standard the most the most, I guess, permissive standards. So when I was talking about how there are different standards with respect to a hostile work environment, so in New York it could be different than Texas. I'm just taking that as an example. I actually would have to look at Texas's law, but you would want to take the most, well, I said permissive, but really restrictive is you would want to standardize the New York standard. And I would say that with any compliance issue, because it is very difficult to, at least now, especially with working from home, to make sure the right standard is being applied in the right situation. And generally with compliance-related issues, you do want to be more, in our codes of conduct, we do not say, the harassment and discrimination laws are not what we strive to create in our workplaces. We strive to create a much better environment than what that bar is, and so the laws don't, usually you want a better environment or a more inclusive environment than what the laws require.
It seems like trainings would go a long way in preventing some legal entanglements, and one of the survey questions we asked that didn't appear in this presentation but is in the longer report that we published at complianceweek.com, we asked the survey respondents, what additional trainings has your employer provided? We asked them if they had home office ergonomics, home office accident prevention, anti-harassment and bullying training for remote work settings, IT security for remote employees. Only 3%, 3% of respondents said that they had anti-harassment and bullying training. So, just offering training in that area could really go a long way, it seems. And 35% of respondents said they had IT security for remote settings. So it definitely seems like employers could take advantage of that to avoid some of the legal complications that come from looking at different jurisdictions. So
yeah,
we're down.
A lot of sense.
We're down to the last 3 minutes. So I think if you want, we can take one more quick question. And
sure.
Okay, sure. So one person said, it seems like communication is going to be a key element of a successful return to a workplace plan. When should I start communicating my plan? How should I communicate it?
So I think, of course, it depends on the type of company you're at and, the industry and also the makeup of your workforce, but in terms of location and such. But I think communication, whatever information you have, it's important to get it out to your workforce as soon as possible. And what some of our clients have been doing is having town hall meetings. So it's everybody in the company gets on a town hall, and the managing, partner or the CEO, gets on it and gives an update as to what the firm is or the company is looking at and what they're doing. And even if you don't have the set policy in place because the information is not there yet, it's helpful for your workforce to understand that it's being looked at, it's being considered. I think it's also helpful to provide a forum for input, and it can be done in any number of different ways. But input so that people feel like they're heard. We at my firm, our office meetings, we have what used to be a anonymous comment box. Now it's not terribly anonymous because we're doing it by email, but those types of issues were raised and addressed, and it was really helpful and has been helpful for employees to feel like a part of the decision-making process. And just related to that, as I was saying, a place for feedback and a place for comment. I think with respect to, as we were talking about with discrimination and harassment and really any other issue, that you ensure that your company has an easily accessible reporting mechanism in place. Either it's a hotline or, as I was talking about, regular management check-ins, but to provide a forum for people who may not have a lot of interaction and cannot, drop in and see somebody, an HR person down the hall. I think that's very important.
All right, thank you, Amy. All right, thank you so much for a very informative session. Again, everyone, our speakers today were Amy Foote, myself, Alyson McDevitt, my dog, and Charlie Voelker. I'd like to give a special thanks to Skillsoft for making this webcast possible. Once again, to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. The webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you are having trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to webcasts@complianceweek.com. This webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week members on our website under the webcast tab, which also contains a library of additional CPE webcasts. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a member, please contact us at info@complianceweek.com. This concludes our webcast. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.